This is an escalation sigil required to do Astaroth. This is 75 escalation sigils required to do 75 Astaroths. It took 234 strong rooms to get 75 escalation sigils. And it took 618 nightmare dungeons to get 234 strong rooms. And all of that took 46 hours, 1 minute, and 57 seconds. 75 escalation sigils is not enough to do 100 Astaroths, but I will find some escalation sigils along the way. Hopefully, it'll be enough to sustain me to 100 runs. Do we get a mythic unique on the first run? No. On run 2, Astaroth drops 3200 Obdicite, but it remains on the floor. That's because I'm at the cap from doing all the nightmare dungeons for the escalation sigils originally. 999k. Pretty annoying. On run 7, 28 minutes in, we find an Ahu rune. On run 8, 1 hour and 33 minutes in, we find a 3-star legendary two-handed staff. Oh damn! If the maximum life was intelligence, then I can sell that for like basically whatever I want. The average time it took me to do an escalating nightmare was 12 minutes and 31 seconds. On run 9, 1 hour and 44 minutes in, we find a Zal rune. A Zal rune. Damn. On run 11, 1 hour and 58 minutes in, we find a 2-star X-Fal ring. On run 19, 2 hours and 22 minutes in, we find 3-star legendary gloves. The slowest time it took me to do an escalating nightmare was 17 minutes and 24 seconds. On run 21, 3 hours and 57 minutes in, we find an Om rune. Later that run, we find a 3-star legendary amulet. On run 26, 4 hours and 31 minutes in, we find 3-star legendary boots. Run 29, 5 hours and 36 minutes in, we find a Tem rune. Later that run, we find 2-star legendary pants. On run 31, 6 hours and 15 minutes in, we find a 2-star blue rose. The fastest time it took me to do an escalating nightmare was 6 minutes and 55 seconds. On run 35, 6 hours and 41 minutes in, we run into a gelatinous goblin. Massive amount of boss materials. Later that run, we find a 2-star legendary amulet. On run 37, 7 hours and 36 minutes in, we find a 2-star Flameweaver. Later that run, we find a 2-star legendary Focus. On run 45, 8 hours and 2 minutes in, we find a 3-star legendary one-handed mace. Later that run, we find 2-star legendary gloves. On run 46, 9 hours and 48 minutes in, we run into a gelatinous goblin. A massive amount of boss materials. On run 52, 10 hours and 1 minute in, we find 3-star legendary armor. Also, a 2-star legendary ring. On run 53, 1 hour and 15 minutes in, we get stuck in a nightmare dungeon. Okay, that is trash. Unfortunately, I had to abandon the key. On run 55, 11 hours and 38 minutes in, we find 2-star legendary gloves. Later that run, we get stuck in a nightmare dungeon. Damn it. Key, unfortunately, wasted. On run 59, 12 hours and 9 minutes in, we find an Ahu rune. Later that run, we find a 2-star legendary focus. Later that run, we find 2-star legendary boots. On run 60, 12 hours and 51 minutes in, we find a 3-star Chaos Godslayer crown. Also, 3-star legendary gloves. The total number of Chaos Uniques in the 100 runs was 15 Chaos Uniques. On run 62, 13 hours in, we find a 3-star legendary ring. On run 74, 13 hours and 24 minutes in, we find 3-star legendary pants. On run 77, 15 hours and 52 minutes in, we run into a gelatinous goblin. A massive amount of boss materials. We find a 2-star legendary ring. On run 80, 16 hours and 27 minutes in, we find a jaw rune. The total number of strong rooms that appeared in the escalation nightmares was 116 strong rooms. On run 81, 17 hours and 14 minutes in, we find a mythic unique. Materials Might. Mythic, baby! Later that run, we find 2-star legendary gloves. And later that run, we find a 2-star Azurath. On run 84, 17 hours and 28 minutes in, we find a 2-star legendary ring. Later that run, we find an Ahu rune. On run 86, 18 hours and 12 minutes in, we find a 2-star Raiment of the Infinite. Later that run, we find 2-star legendary boots. On run 87, 18 hours and 37 minutes in, we get stuck in a nightmare dungeon. Damn it! This is like the third one. Unfortunately, I had to abandon the key. Doing Astaroth runs dropped nightmare dungeon sigils that are guaranteed to have strong rooms in them, so I can easily farm more escalation sigils if necessary, but still annoying. On run 89, 18 hours and 58 minutes in, we find an Eom rune. On run 92, 19 hours and 20 minutes in, we gamble a 4-star Lokran's Talisman. Whoa! Damn! On run 93, 20 hours and 2 minutes in, we find 2-star legendary boots. Later that run, we find a 2-star Vox Omnium. On run 95, 20 hours and 10 minutes in, we find a 2-star legendary dagger. Later that run, we find a Tam rune. Later that run, we find a 2-star legendary staff. The number of legendary runes that dropped over the 100 runs was 9 legendary runes. On the final run, run 100, do we get a mythic unique? No. So having 75 escalation nightmares was enough to sustain me through to the 100 runs. The total number of escalation sigils that dropped was 34 escalation sigils, and that means 13 were left over. The total time it took me to do 100 escalating nightmares was 21 hours, 5 minutes, and 17 seconds.